Kerrimuir Road means house by the water, and it really got its beginnings about 3 kilometers east of here at Brown's Brae, where Johnny Brown was brought with his family of 7 other siblings to a new homestead with his mom and dad, Duncan and Jessie Brown. Well, in 1910, he was given the property that we know of today as Kerrimuir through his mother, who had been bequested the land from an Annie Williams. The first thing he would have probably done is build a road in, and the road is quite curvy because there were many favorite trees that John Brown loved and wouldn't take them down, so he went around them. He knew it was going to be a very difficult task, but he tried, and he cleared a big pasture where he had the 1 cow and 2 horses, and he built 2 big barns, and there was a chicken coop, and there was an area that he built a tripod for making maple syrup. There's a great big black pot that they used to boil the syrup in. And then he also had many people that would come back here and help. Johnny Preston, he used to come and take the hay off the pasture. And Bunny Dawson, he was a man that could do anything. He could fix anything, build anything. He was back here helping. And William Langmaid would come with a boat selling vegetables and fresh meat. And Mary Roberts, just outside of Baysville, she had a huge vegetable garden where we were always, it seemed, going there buying a lot of food from this Mary Roberts. John would work during the day, and then he would canoe into Baysville to pick up the mail. The one common thing that Kerrimuir has with all the cottagers, we would meet at the farmhouse every day, and Dr. Charles, or sometimes Dr. Haynes, would pick up the mail from Baysville. And the other thing was the Browns had the only crank telephone, which we were all made comfortable to use. The operator, her name was Miss Langford in Baysville, but that's what really made us all sort of get to know one another and become good friends. John Brown in 1915 married my grandfather's sister, Margaret Lindsay. They were both in their 40s when they got married, so they never did have any children. Johnny Brown built Haynes Cottage. It has 7 bedrooms. It had a washroom, very uncommon back in the 20s. He built it for his original farmhouse, but for some reason he moved and built another farmhouse right by the roadway. And he also built Glenmount Hotel that his sister would run, and later they owned Glenmount Hotel. That was taken down in the 60s, but that's pretty well how he made a living up here, by building. Because of my aunt, my dad and his brothers used to come up for several weeks during the summer after school was out to help with farm chores and just give the Browns company. When we came up to the cottage too, we had to open the farm gate because of the 1 cow and 2 horses in the pasture. And so it seemed to me always my turn to get out of the car, open the gate, make sure it was securely locked again before we went through up to our cottage.
Sometime my brothers and I played a little mischief and would unlock the gate, open it up, and the cows had a bell on, so you knew where the cow was, and Mr. and Mrs. Brown would have to angrily come and go to the woods and get their cow and take it back home. So whenever you went to see them, Johnny Brown had his feet in the oven, keeping them warm. And Mrs. Brown always would show you her maps of the property, and she felt she owned more property than what the map displayed.
My dad loved working outside. He was always puttering. He would get here and he would put on rubber boots, a white t-shirt, and always had a hammer in his hand. I didn't want to be inside with my mom doing cooking and cleaning, so I was my dad's helper. I loved it outside. My dad bought a lot from my Uncle John in 1943, and he built a 16 by 20 shack, and it had a tin chimney. Every morning the woodpecker would come and peck on the tin chimney and wake everyone up in the morning. He would always come up with a big bag of bent nails, and he would spend hours straightening the nails to build the cottage. This was like during the war, so you couldn't get a lot of supplies. And he was even he had so many bent nails that he used to supply Harold Tickle, who was building the log cabin next door, with nails. So they had plenty of nails.
The cottage we're sitting in currently was built by my grandfather and his brothers in 1934. Edgar Lang was his name, and he was a dentistry from Dundas. And they had bought the property here, he and my grandmother, in 1931, and they also bought another lot 2 doors down from the Browns, from Johnny Brown in 1931, as I said, and then they built this cottage. It was a panabode that was delivered from Hamilton to here by train and then assembled. My grandmother met my grandfather, the dentist, as he was playing in the orchestra at the Wawa Hotel, and she was home for the summer. She was training to be a nurse in Niagara Falls, New York, and came home to stay with her mother for the summer, and they met, and then they ended up purchasing here on Kerrimuir Road because it reminded them so much of the beach at Norway Point.
Back in the early 1900s, I think 1912, I believe, or 1910, my grandfather and grandmother and the sons Bert, my father, and my Uncle Jack, and 4 daughters bought the cottage across the Bigwin Inn from, I think, the Hamilton family. My grandparents continued with the cottage, but as they passed away, it continued to be used by my 2 aunts, Winnie and Jessie, who were maiden ladies and came up from Dundas every summer. And they kept the cottage there until I think the late 50s, and then sold it to the McLeans from Hamilton. But it was a wonderful spot there, and got to know the Switzers next door, and then later the Pedens and Truscotts, later on in sailing races at Bigwin and that sort of thing.
My dad and my mom, when they married, their honeymoon was at Britannia. Well, you know, when you said, you know, Uncle Hugh was urging them to buy a place up here, and they found this place. And it was owned by Mr. Thomas. And he decided to sell it because his only child, unfortunately, had perished in a car accident on the way here, so he wanted to sell. And he wanted, back in the day, just a ginormous amount of money. And it would have been a staggering sum. It was $40,000. And my mother had an aunt who passed away, who left her a home in Port Colborne, which she'd sold, and it was $25,000 she had to spend. And he said, "Oh, that's just, you know, that's just not enough." And I remember my mother telling me that one evening in October, because they really wanted this place, they called Mr. Thomas and said, you know, "Have you had any other buyers or a change of heart?" And he said, "You know, you've got a young family, and this is a place for families. I'll do the deal at 25 grand. So that's how we came to get it. And how my father came here. I thought that he started shoveling coal on the Sangamo, which is...
That's right. So he was in Muskoka a long time ago, because I remember him telling me he worked on the Sangamo and they paid him $1 a day. I think that was to make me feel better for my allowance.
My mom had 2 little babies to look after, and she had a kerosene little stove that she had to boil water, no electricity, make formula, clean diapers. I don't know how she ever did it. My dad loved it up here. My mom was not crazy about coming to the cottage.
As I remember it, my mom came as a child, and she came up with her mother to keep her company up at Britannia. That's where she learned how to golf, and that's where she learned how to play tennis. And so she'd been on Lake of Bays for, kind of as long as she could, really remember. And I recall my mom saying that my dad had grown up in a farming sort of family, or his relatives had farms. And he imagined a horse farm or something like that. And my mother's like, oh no, that's way too much work.
When I was a youngster, 79 years ago, my older brother Philip and I got our feet wet here in the beach on Kerrimuir Road, and my parents rented Johnny Brown's cottage, which is now the Kelk Cottage. We then, different summers, went to different places where my father and mother rented, which we enjoyed, and finally acquired our cottage in 1949.
There's one memory that the kind of the bonding that took place between the Pecks and the Callahans, and it goes back to the Vietnam War. John, like a lot of young Americans, was having a lot of difficulty deciding what it was he was going to do, and he talked about coming to Canada and living in Canada, and was struggling with it. And he came up on this one visit to see my family, and stayed with us at our home. And we had a cat, and John's allergic to cats. So my father, as you know, was a doctor, and he saw John get all swelled up and said, "John, I think you're having an asthma attack." And he said, "No, Dr. Callahan, it's a cat." He goes, "John, I think you're having an asthma attack. Why don't I write a letter to the draft board on your behalf?" So John took that letter to the draft board, got 4F status, which in those days meant he didn't have to go for medical reasons. And John was so indebted to my father for that. I mean, he was, I'll never forget it. He was like, "Thank you, Dr. Callahan. I didn't think a letter from a Canadian doctor was going to help me, but you probably saved my life."
It was a pleasure when Mr. and Mrs. Adamson, Gordon Adamsons from Adamson's Island, would come over a few times each summer, park at the dock, and acquire some eggs or purchase some eggs and vegetables from Farmer Brown. And that's how we got to know Mr. and Mrs. Adamson, and they were very kind to invite us over, which we did a few times each summer, to see their cottage and the guest cabins.
I saw Mr. Adamson, I think, grand total of once. It was quite warm out, but he had on a Hudson's Bay coat, like, the old blanket style Hudson Bay coats, and managed to slip off his dog into the water in this Hudson Bay coat. And my sister Jeanette pulled him out because the coat must have weighed probably like 100 pounds by the time he had this on. But he was always very, from what I recall, generous about people using the island. He had Craig Teakle there for a while, patrolling the shore. But what he was mostly concerned about was people leaving junk on the island. Kind of a truce was eventually reached where if you took everything with you, he really wasn't going to bother you too much. The Adamsons, as well as the Pecks, have always had the utmost respect for what Muskoka is all about and what Lake of Bays was all about. Dr. Peck donated Root Hog Island to the University of Toronto. Imagine the botany students to be up there. There's species of trees on that island that you don't see any other place. So they had a dedication to the environment up here.
The days that we would come up to the cottage, we would start after work, after my dad finished work. So it was often quite late that we would arrive in Baysville. But we would come up, and from Bracebridge, you would come to the highway. It was back then 118, and you would go down Stoneleigh Road, where there was a gas station down there, and then back out onto the roller coaster road. And we would come into Baysville, and we would get all excited when we were about to turn the corner at the old Lincoln Lodge, to see if the light bulb was shining. If it was, that meant Miss Connolly was up waiting for any cottagers to arrive so they could buy milk and bread and whatnot. But we would always be waiting to see if that light bulb was shining. And it is still today a bare light bulb, and it's still shining.
We used to get chickens delivered to us by Ross Heaney. He'd come along the road and come into your house. The chicken was defeathered, but it wasn't gutted, and he'd come into your kitchen counter and prepare it for you, and you knew he was here by the smell of the chicken. But I remember too in Baysville at Miss Nell's, the old Langmaid store, where you sit now and enjoy a cup of tea and have your sandwich, was his cutting board, and he'd cut your leg of lamb or whatever have you in the old Langmaid store. So
We'd go, my mom would always visit Miss Nell because, of course, my grandmother grew up with all of those people. And it was always a high little voice. And it was, hello, Betty. Betty, how are you? How are you, Betty? Oh, and is this Fran? Oh, Fran, hi.
One thing we do remember of Baysville in Langmaid's store was Miss Langmaid's cash register. And it was a big machine with anytime we went in with friends or guests, we said, have a look at the cash register. She'd crank the handle, it wouldn't always work, and I don't know how she counted. I think she just counted by counting things up, but that was a very ancient piece of equipment.
And it was on the counter that's there now, but they've moved the counter.
One of the things that my Uncle Hugh was passionate about was boats. He had, Jones just sold it a few years ago, Shepherd Boats, and Jimmy Hahn was across the bay, and he was affiliated with Shepherd Boats, and so Hughie had a passion for boats and racing boats and all kinds of things. So one year he won the big race of the big Lake Ontario race because he was in a new type of boat called a Donzie. And the Donzie's big claim to fame in those days was it could go somewhere between 50 and 60 miles an hour. So one of the great joys of the McFarland boys was waiting for the ferry to cross between Bigwin Island and the mainland with that great big wake, and getting the Donzie up to full torque at about somewhere between 50 and 60 miles an hour and hitting the wake to see if we could get the Donzie out of the water and across the wake.
My uncle had spent time down in Florida in the Everglades, and he'd met all the people who put on these fancy water ski shows down there. I guess it was sort of the beginning of, people going to water ski shows to see, pyramids and slalom skiing and barefoot skiing and all that sort of thing. And somehow or another, he invited them up to Lake of Bays, and he had a whole system set up here. He had a slalom course set up, he had a ski jump set up, the whole business. And then, of course, when these guys came up, they taught him how to ski properly and how to use those kinds of things. And I guess the suggestion was made that maybe skiing behind an airplane might also be fun. The arrangement was, thou shalt not take off. But he got going fast enough, and then the airplane took off. And then I think, as I recall my uncle telling me the story, the skis became, so the airplane took off. And of course, when it does that, you break all that resistance, and the airplane would probably accelerate 10 or 15 miles an hour almost right away.
He had a Cessna 185 that he took great pride in. He just had it painted. Since airplanes aren't meant to pull water skiers, it sucked up all the water at the front and proceeded to strip all this new paint that he just put on the plane onto Hughie the skier, who was now covered in white and green aviation paint as he flew behind the airplane. And Jones said, his wife, when he let go, he skipped like a stone.
And as a youngster growing up, my father and the older gentlemen, the cottage owners, sailed Ackroyd dinghies. Dr. Bruce Charles, my father Bert, Fran's dad George Horning, Seasane, and a little bit with the Holtons. She had a dinghy she joined in sometime. Then the Ballmans, he had a Lightning, he was from Detroit. And then later, Pam Cooper's father, Doug Cooper, bought an albacore, which was different to the Ackroyd dinghies. But every morning, after 9 o'clock, they had breakfast, and out they'd go, the gentlemen, and just have a wonderful sailing time to the little island beside Peck's Island, which they called Daisy May, the Baysville boy.
Betty Charles, Dr. Charles's wife, was often the boss of the beach, and she would be in charge of this whole thing. and present the trophy, which of course was a chamber pot. And we'd have other, I think, races and things like that.
Annually, Alf Van Someren, who from Hamilton across the lake, I think his daughter married a Van Wyck, and he had what was called the Journey's End Trophy, one race in the summer, and people down by the Days and Shepherds that had sailboats also joined in the race, so they did that, and that was called the Journey's End Trophy.
But we would water ski when we were old enough to get up on water skis, and from dawn till, of course, you had to go out when it was early because it was flat, and we could start right off the sand, so it was a wonderful place to slalom ski.
My mom and dad were always working, always, it seemed, every other year building on to the cottage, and my mom would work right along with my dad. So nobody entertained us. We had to use our imagination. I remember once Bren and I found a family of baby mice that had just been born. So we wrapped them in a basket, tried to feed them raspberries. That was fun. But the other thing for entertainment, my mom and dad would take us to the garbage dump to watch the bears.
I was 11 years old when we moved into the cottage on that rainy summer, and water was just the focus of everyone's life. Whether it was swimming, Kathy, Charles, and I would be in the water from morning till dinner if we were allowed. Usually we had to take an hour break for lunch, and then we were back in the water. Played beach volleyball with a big group down on Kerrimuir Beach, and that was so much fun. Oh, and we just loved playing with the older boys. Oh, they were so exciting and handsome and all the rest of it.
We would have sleepovers with the girls, and we'd play Truth or Dare. And so Kathy, Charles had a cabin behind her cottage, and so we would sleep out there, read True Detective magazines, and talk about everybody else. And my cousin and I, when we'd had enough of just the family here, we'd go up and sit in the little house up the hill and talk about everybody and look out over the water. It was quite a nice place to be. We also attended Haynes weddings, and the Leonards would come to, because we lived in Waterdown near Dundas, we'd have birthday parties for people who were turning 70 and 80 and 85, and always the people from the beach. The Kerrimuir clan would be included in everything we did.
My father was quite a craftsman, loved making things. Anyway, in the early 50s, he built a boat, a 14-foot mahogany walnut boat, and got the drawings and cut things and built it in the garage and used the steam kettle to bend wood and that sort of thing. He called it the Happy Bee. By the way, the Happy Bee is short for Happy Bottom. My mother's name was Gladys. So that's how father got Happy Bee. Anyway, the boat is in Flesherton. I brought this along. Bobby Smith, friend's cousin, is sort of restoring the boat plank by plank. There he has it in his lovely, one of his barns in Flesherton, and he gave this to us last summer, which is from the dashboard, and it says, custom built by S.B. Leonard and Sons, Dundas.
So there was a boathouse that used to be out here, and there were 2 ladders on either side of the slip. So if you swam from ladder to ladder, that meant you could be on the dock with a life jacket. If you could swim from the ladder to the beach, you could be on the dock without a life jacket. And if you could go what they call point to point, which is the point here, and the point back over there.
You know, there was someone with us while we were doing the long swim, but yeah, probably not a bad idea if you're going to be in a small boat to know how to get, you know, back to shore at least with some power on your own. We'd start water skiing up here on the 24th of May and go as long as possible. Thanksgiving, that's right. And
we'd only do it for a short run though, just so we could say we had.
A lot of good times. We'd get together with, you know, Tim, and then the Peck boys were big into water skiing.
Excellent water skiers. Both John and David, very good water skiers.
Probably 30 of the boats that make up the Muskoka collection of classic boats were built by Cameron Peck. Baysville Marina was his personal boathouse.
When we
wanted to have some fun, we'd go across to Bigwin for the dance they always had. We got to know the guys in Chico Valle's band quite well. And after the dances, we'd say, well, to Wally, who was a drummer, and there was another one, I forget his name, but he played the fiddle and whatnot. And at that time, I could play the banjo a little bit. I said, come on over, let's have a party at our place. Well, sometimes we had half of the guests of Bigwin there, out in the middle of nowhere, in their fancy gowns, which was the old homestead of this Dan Watson.
I worked at Bigwin in 1968. The last year it was public, and I worked on the front desk. The telephone system at that time were trunk lines, and so you had to put the plug in and take the plug out and connect the room. The call would come in. The first day that I was doing it, Bell Canada actually phoned and thought the whole system was broken. But it was a wonderful place to work, and still have some friends from that time that I met. I lived there. They had staff quarters. It was in the rotunda, up in the second floor in the back. Of course, we'd be finished work, and we would all go over to the point across, and there'd be bonfires and get-togethers after on the other side of the island, and it was just really a wonderful experience.
Would have a race every Saturday, and then at the end of the race, everybody they put the big lunch out, and it was Chicho Valley. Okay, he was there, and I can remember as a kid listening, thinking this is pretty exotic music, and and there'd be a big buffet, and everybody'd sit around, and they'd have lunch, and there'd be tables with umbrellas over them. It was really lovely.
Well, the ski jump at Bigwin was like the biggest temptation on the lake, and I have sort of a vague memory of attempting to get onto that ski jump, but it was kind of I don't really think I got too far up the ski jump before I chickened out and kind of tripped over the edge of it into the water more than anything else. I always watched with great admiration those that could kick it up, but I never really had the courage to go the full Monty on it.
My first recollections of driving to the cottage were with my parents, and we had the road in from Bracebridge to here was the original road, 2-lane, really narrow, and it would take most of the time to get here, it would seem.
When my dad finally got to the cottage after hours of driving, he would take me in the iron wheelbarrow over to Johnny Brown's ice house, and John would get us a great big block of ice and to bring back for putting in the ice box here.
And we didn't have indoor plumbing, and so every day when we got up, we had to get the buckets of water from the lake for washing up and dishes. And then the drinking water, the Haynes had a well that we had to also collect the water from that was drinking water. And there was a little table that sat inside the back veranda door, and the left bucket was for dishes, the right bucket was the drinking water. And then once that was done, we had to get our little bin and go and collect twigs so that we could light the fire. So we didn't have running water until the 60s, and we didn't have an indoor toilet until the 70s, and a shower maybe in the 80s. So we had an outdoor shower I would hook up to a hose. And so we only really had the 2 weeks here, but it was, I remember I had braids, and Tom Hain and Doug Hain, who lived next door, they'd tie me to a tree with them. And I couldn't get them undone. I was just quite mean, but it was funny at the time too.
In the McCormick store, you could get a roasted beef or a nut and bolt to fit your
That's
piping
right.
if you needed to get something done. So Gord McCormick was a wonderful man. When I'd go with my father to do things or launch his boat or whatever have you, he'd often give me a quarter for being a good boy.
My mom and dad had actually come up at one point in the winter and spent a night to kind of try it out, and it worked. So they were pretty excited about that, but my dad told me he was always worried that the roof would collapse halfway through the night because the big problem was like how heavy is the snow. But what happened was on the way up, we went off the road big time, and we were in this station wagon. And of course, in those days, nobody had seat belts. So there were kids and food everywhere inside the car, and it rolled over a few times. And I remember my mom telling me that she looked back and was just shocked and worried beyond belief, because all she could see was red everywhere. And fortunately, what she'd forgotten was that she'd packed a casserole with tomato sauce in it and that sort of thing. And that's what it sort of colored the back. And so there's all this sort of meat and potatoes and tomatoes all through the back. And she'd taken that to mean that her children were no longer. And then I think we just sort of took the lesson to heart. It's like, no, it's really not possible to get up here in the winter. So it wasn't until I was maybe university that we started. We put the hot water in, or the pipe was heated out to the lake, and that kind of thing. And we spent a couple of Christmases up here, and it was lovely.
And if you wanted to come, you had to let Austin know at the beginning of the season that you wanted to use it, because then he could plow the road. Because if you didn't get on that plow route right at the beginning of the season, then there was just no way to get in here. Austin was our neighbor in the city and here. He had the house behind us on Russell Hill Road, and he had this house up here. So Austin looked after his mother and then would be up here. And then eventually, as time went on, he was here full time. And he was the kind of the master of the road, and if there was a problem or something you needed to get done on the road, Austin was always your go-to guy. He loved the wilderness. When Austin would take his vacation from Muskoka, he didn't go south, he went farther north, right? Because he'd hunt and he'd fish, and this was his center. He was an engineer. He obviously had good success with that and in running the toy company, but his passion was clearly being here.
I always remember my mom coming up in early April or late March, and I was thinking, like, what are you gonna do? And she'd say, oh no, as soon as I get up here, I give Ann a call, and they get together and they'd have dinner, and they were great friends. And I think it really made my mom's time up here, a lot more enjoyable. She enjoyed her companionship a lot, and they went, they both had families to chat about, and this really deep fondness for Lake of Bays and all the vistas that you see here. And I think my mom kind of envied Ann in a way, sort of being here over the winter and seeing that develop, and the snow and the ice, forming and then it breaking up, and it was.
I will never forget. There was an occasion, gosh, it's got to be about 30 years ago, where Ann managed to get Anton Querti, who was a world-renowned pianist, to come and do a concert at the Baysville Community Center, right? And we all dutifully went off, and so Ann had a lot of refinement. There's another doctor down here, Dr. Charles, as well. I think most people respected, my dad when he was off. What I do remember is him taking a lot of porcupine quills and fish hooks out of people. That was one thing.
If because people would come by every now and then, oh, my daughter's sick, or somebody said, could you just come over and just have a look, that kind of thing, or we think my child has appendicitis or whatever. So I said, did anything ever unusual happen? He said, well, one night your mom and I were sleeping in our bedroom, and all of a sudden there's these two guys in our bedroom, and they're waking me up, shaking, Dr. Callahan, you've got to come right away. And he's like, what? In the middle of the night? And he said, they woke him up in the middle of the night from a dead sleep. They brought him down here. They had a little tinny, so nothing for a boat, and they took him out, and the lake is wild. There's a big storm going on. And my dad's like, what am I doing here? When we first got here, it was a party line. So I think he called the telephone company, which I imagine was Bell, and said, well, I'm a doctor. I need my own phone. If there's an emergency, I need to be able to get through. And so we had our own phone. We were the only people on the beach that were not part of the party line.
I admire pioneer people that came up here and worked so hard. They were musical, they entertained themselves.
We hold these places almost in trust. We are the users of it during our lifetime, and the legacy goes to our children. And if there's one thing on this road that I've seen is we're into 5 generations of families that have been here.
The importance of the lake to me is, first of all, I love the country, the scenery, and when I first came here, I couldn't wait to leave on a Friday night to come up to Workaway. And my son is doing the same thing still. You know, every weekend he's up, he's doing something different.
In the Hamilton Spectator in 1955, they published a photograph of the road signs coming into Kerrimuir Road, the families. And what is remarkable is it was not until a year and a half ago that one of these properties moved to a different family.
When Kathy Charles passed away, a friend acquired a bench, and it's to be left on the beach, her beach or our beach, and as people walk along to go to see your neighbors, and people do travel the beach to say hello to neighbors, that's a spot you can sit down and say hello, or just remember our dear friend Kathy Charles on that bench.
When you see that spiritual sense, they're all here. I don't think anyone actually ever leaves.